Kris Yagel. He's going to speak to us on evolution of today's top leaders. Thanks, Kris.
Several years ago, I had the good fortune of meeting one of the world-class adventurers living on the earth today. Her name's Allison Levine. I met her right down here a mile away or so at the Thayer Hotel, and she talked about some of her adventures. See, Allison's part of the Adventure Grand Slam, which means she's been on the highest peaks on every continent. She's also been to the North and South Poles by foot. Allison is truly extraordinary, but what makes her even more extraordinary is the fact that she overcame some physical limitations. First of all, she was born with a congenital heart defect, making it nearly impossible when she was young to climb a flight of stairs without exhaustion. Secondly, she has a condition that is affected by the cold, making her 4 or more times more likely to get frostbite. Her capillaries constrict in cold weather. Despite all those things, she overcame that and marked some accomplishments in the climbing world, the exploration world, and was asked to lead the first American all-women's team to the top of Everest in 2004. They spent 2 months on the mountain of Everest, getting acclimated to the different elevations, part of which time they spent in what's called the death zone. The death zone is above 26,200 feet. When a human being enters that elevation, they slowly begin to die. Part of her 2 months was spent there. All the months of preparation that went into it, the 2 months on the mountain, all came down to that day when they were due to summit Mount Everest, reach the top. They reached a couple hundred feet away. They had to turn around, just shy of their goal. And I said, Allison, how could you turn around that close? What happened? And she said the conditions had gone to hell, and to continue would have been a death wish. All that work, all that preparation, the goal in sight, her team looking at her, and they were so close, and the opportunity of a lifetime was missed due to bad conditions. You see, conditions are a part of every failure, every success, and they're even integral to life itself. Let's consider for a moment biological evolution. We can define that as a process where living things undergo environmental conditions or stimuli, and whereby they undergo micro changes that compile over time to create a macro effect. Let me give you an example. The flu virus slowly becomes resistant to vaccine over time until we have a strain that's totally immune to that vaccine. And it continues. Micro changes over time compiles to a macro effect. Conditions also define the age we are in. We are no longer in the information age. Even though information travels as high as it's ever been, we have left that age and we're entering what most experts consider the experience age. And I'll prove it to you. When's the last time you typed out a status update on your social media versus sending a picture or a short video? We're all about experiences. Now, experiences are an emotional response to the conditions present at the time. Let me jar some of those emotions. I'm going to mention 3 places and take note of how you feel when I say them. Number 1, Starbucks. Number 2, Disney. Number 3, the Apple Store. Do you feel your emotions? They changed, right? Just by the mere mention of those places. The conditions present created your experience. They jarred your emotions. Conditions are created by resources. We live in a day and age where there are unlimited resources available to us. Businesses can get raw materials, training, information from anywhere very quickly. And with that, they can create optimal conditions that create a unique experience. But this isn't just available to businesses, it's available to leaders. Leaders have infinite resources to create the right conditions for their team's success. If you're the president of a company and you have a vice president who you'd like to lead more like Abraham Lincoln, you can buy the Audible of his biography, send it to their account, tell them to listen to it, and you'll discuss it next quarter. If your team needs more discipline, go on Amazon, buy Mike Nemeth's book on discipline, drop ship it to your team and let them read it. Discuss it in a couple months or every Friday at your staff call. They need an immersive experience. Find out when Tony Robbins is going to be in town and send them to unleash the power within. All things are available to leaders nowadays. This day and age calls for a different type of leader. We need leaders who understand the power of conditions in shaping a large effect. We also need leaders willing to do what it takes, because it's not always fun, to make the right conditions for their teams and their people to have the best chance for growth and success. We need evolutionary leaders. Let's call them Evo leaders. Now, before we talk about the mechanics of this type of leadership, we have to discuss one prerequisite. And that prerequisite is you got to get the fundamentals right first. It's like a husband who says to a wife, "Honey, I've given you this beautiful home. You have a luxurious car. I support your career, and I don't fight with your friends when they come over. Aren't you happy?" To which she says, "Yeah, but every time I talk, you never listen. You never share any information with me. You leave your socks on the bedroom floor, and you never put the toilet seat down." See, what happened is he forgot the fundamentals and went to the advanced. Evo leaders must first be grounded in fundamental leadership before they can get to this advanced level, but it is the one that we need. Consider for a second, if you stop there, you're going to miss a great opportunity. So fundamentals first. Here in my hand I have an egg. Don't worry, front row. If I push on this egg at any one point, I can break it pretty easily, probably put my finger right through it. However, if I turn the egg oblong and apply pressure uniformly across the egg, it won't break. You can see my knuckles are turning white. I'm trying to break the egg. It's near impossible. It's near impossible. Hens don't lay eggs and then stand on top of them with their pointy toes and say, "I lead you to hatch." No, instead what they do is they gently nestle themselves down after they've plucked out their chest feathers for maximum heat transfer. They don't go to relieve themselves, and they barely eat for the 21-day incubation period. See, what they do is they create the right conditions for their peeps to hatch. They don't just focus on one way. It's the surrounding conditions. Leadership, this type of leadership, is the same. If you rely solely on your direct leadership, you can crack your people. Instead, you have to consider that as one dimension of many, and you have to surround them with the right conditions for success. So let's talk about some examples of leadership. Someone near and dear, probably to our hearts here at West Point, Ulysses S. Grant, former president, commander of Union forces during the Civil War, known as a stoic, very calm, unshakable leader. In fact, we saw evidence of this at the Battle of Shiloh. On the first day, the Confederate Army surprised Union forces and handed them a considerable loss, in the thousands actually. That night, General Grant found himself leaning against a tree. He had also fallen off his horse that day and sprained his ankle, possibly broke it. It was throbbing, he couldn't sleep. He had just been dealt a heck of a loss. It was raining to top it off, so he's leaning against a tree smoking a cigar. And up comes another West Point graduate, William Sherman, one of his subordinate generals. And on his way there, Sherman was going to initially say, "Hey, General Grant, we need to retreat." But he changed his mind before he got there. And instead, he walked up to the general and he said, "Boy, we sure had the devil's day today, General Grant." To which General Grant looked at him and calmly said, "Yes." Took a puff of his cigar, said, "Yes. Lick 'em tomorrow, though." Never shaken, never stirred. You see, that type of leadership is critical because General Grant knew that that condition of his emotions was critical to the morale and confidence in leadership of the Union Army. You see, he knew he had to set that. Evo leaders set the right emotional conditions and they keep them in check. They are thermostats, not thermometers. Our next example is very different, although just as powerful. A great example of Evo leadership. Frederick Taylor was a thought leader at the beginning of the 1900s during the Second American Industrial Revolution. He was what was later considered the father of the efficiency movement, the father of modern manufacturing. We call that today industrial engineering. Now, what Taylor would do first is he would select the right people to work in the factories of the time. Steel was one of the major products during this Industrial Revolution. And to have steel, you needed a very hot fire. Steel is made with hot fire, which is why I always tell leaders, keep the fire hot, because the hardest steel is made with the hottest fire. So what he would do is, after selecting the right person, fully qualified for the job, high potential, great attributes, he would then study them. Let's say there's a worker whose job it was to shovel coal into a furnace. Frederick Taylor would position himself so he could observe the worker. He would look at things like the shovel. Is it 4 feet that's optimal? Or is it 5 feet? Should it be 3.5, 3 3/4? How about the spade? Rounded, pointed, squared, 8 inches long, 10 inches long? What is optimal? The pile in relation to the furnace. Should the worker's foot position be squared off? Should it be pointed towards the coal? Should it be pointed toward the furnace? Should he take from the top? Should he take from the bottom? Should he bend at the knees? Should he bend at the waist? What's optimal? And he would go through every position in the factory and try to find out what the optimal procedures were. This may seem a little excessive, but what he knew was optimal production can be missed by the finest conditions if you don't massage them into perfection. He did this over and over again and eventually reached that perfection, became the father of the efficiency movement. Let's talk briefly now about an example of a lack of Evo leadership. Some of you may remember Barry Sanders, NFL running back, my favorite. As a young high school running back, I looked up to him, tried to emulate him as best I could. He was just absolutely incredible. Won the Heisman Trophy, then went on to rush for no less than 1,100 yards per season in the NFL, and actually hit 2,000 yards one season in the NFL. Absolutely mesmerizing to watch, right up until he retired in his prime at the age of 33. See, what happened was the press went after him and they said, well, why'd you retire, Barry? How could you do that? You were in your prime. We enjoyed watching you. How could you let us down? And he said all the typical things. He said, well, the next chapter in my life, I got these other things to do. Well, I don't, I have new goals. And they persisted. And years later, he finally admitted that the legacy of losing in Detroit finally broke his spirit. See, what happened was we had unlimited potential in Barry Sanders, but it was met with the bad conditions of a failing system. So therefore, we'll never know how great he might have done in the next 5 years or so. He had already set almost every record available to running backs. Look him up afterwards. YouTube is highlights. You'll be super impressed. But imagine how many more he would have set. Imagine how many more kids he would have reached who might have looked up to him. Where were the Evo leaders? Where were they to set the right conditions? The Evo leaders were critical for Barry Sanders. Listen, this type of leadership that I'm proposing is very difficult. It's very difficult. It's difficult because we have 5 generations in the workplace, and they all need different conditions to be successful. Unfortunately, nowadays, you can't get by on your charm or even your leadership fundamentals. You need to set the right conditions for success. Now, there's no glory in this either. There's no glory. The best among you will be the quiet servants whose names we do not know, pulling the strings in the background, orchestrating the right conditions for success. There is no glory in this. I know this is heavy. I know it's difficult. You're not all called to do it. And if you're not, I'm not sure what to tell you. Maybe you should have gone to Annapolis. The world we live in today needs Evo leaders who get the power of conditions to create macro change. We need leaders who are willing to do what it takes, the nitty-gritty, the management of these conditions to do what's right, to create the right conditions for growth and for the success of your teams. Oh, and by the way, Allison Levine reached the top of Mount Everest in 2010 when the conditions were right. Thank you.
Thank you, Kris.